We are about to meet my future history crush. He is the one. He is the only. And when I first met him, I did feel like I was meeting Taylor Swift. He hardly needs an introduction. We all know him. It is Professor George. And he is the Princeton's McCormick Chair of Jurisprudence. He is the founding director of the James Madison Program. He is chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I'm always trying to get him to give me a job. Hasn't happened yet. Just hint, hint. He has served on the President's Council on Bioethics. He has been a presidential appointee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's held a U.S. seat on UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. He's a recipient of the U.S. Presidential Citizens Medal. The list goes on and on. The man has like a bazillion honorary degrees. He is a true LFN celebrity. And please help me welcome to the stage Professor Robert P. George.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel. The Taylor Swift line is new to me. I've never been introduced as a Taylor Swift before. I want to begin simply by recognizing what happened this morning in Pittsburgh. Probably you all know that there was a shooting, an anti-Semitic hate crime in which people were killed at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. So I want to begin by offering my condolences to the entire Jewish community with whom all of us stand in solidarity this morning. It's horrible that something like this could happen in our country in 2018, but it happened this morning, and I pray for the victims and their families, and I pray for our country. Well, I am here this morning not with any formal remarks to give you. I just asked for a little time on the schedule to offer a word of encouragement. That word, encouragement, hold it up, have a look at it. What does it mean? What does it mean to encourage? Well, it means to put courage in. When we encourage each other, we are putting courage in each other. And given our mission at this time, that's a virtue that all of us need, the virtue of courage. You don't need me to tell you how difficult it is to stand up today for the values that we believe in, for chastity, for sexual integrity, for marriage as the lifelong covenantal union of man and woman. These ideas, which were not that long ago the common sense not only of our culture, but of most cultures, are now beyond controversial. If you stand up and speak out on behalf of those values, those virtues, those principles, you will be derided as a hater, as a bigot, as someone who doesn't respect the rights of others, of someone who's trying to impose their values on others. And naturally, we human beings who like to be accepted, who don't like to be called names, who don't like to be vilified, will be tempted to shrink back, to go quiet, to go silent, to harbor our beliefs in our breasts, in our hearts. We're tempted to think it's okay to remain faithful silently, so long as we remain faithful. And so to overcome that, we need that virtue of courage. And there's no one for whom that virtue comes naturally, which means we need to put it in each other. We need to support each other. We need to stand in solidarity with each other. We need to empower each other to speak in the face of the vilification, the hostility, even the threats to our own futures. Because we know today that speaking out for what's right, stating the truth boldly, can mean not only that you get vilified, not only that you lose friends, not only that Thanksgiving dinner is ruined in some cases, but it can even cost you professionally. Who knows who Kelvin Cochran is? Does anybody know who Kelvin? Yeah, somebody back there does. I want you all to know who Kelvin Cochran is, because Kelvin Cochran is a brave and heroic man. Kelvin Cochran is a fireman. He's got the courage to rush into burning buildings to save people's lives. Kelvin Cochran is an African-American man who grew up under segregation in Shreveport, Louisiana. And he had to fly in the face of deeply ingrained racial prejudice to achieve his dream of becoming a fireman. But not only did he become a fireman, because of his courage, because of his integrity, because of his skill, because of his gifts, because of his dedication, he was able to become fire chief of Shreveport, Louisiana. And then he was called to become fire chief of a much bigger place, Atlanta, Georgia. And he served as fire chief with great distinction. He made the Atlanta Fire Department the model for the rest of the nation. But then Kelvin Cochran did something that got him into big trouble. He didn't embezzle any money. He didn't cheat anybody. He didn't mistreat anybody. What Kelvin Cochran did was publish a book to be shared with people at his church, because Kelvin Cochran is a Christian. And that book affirmed the Christian doctrine of marriage and sexual morality. Well, guess what happened to Kelvin Cochran for publishing his book? He got fired as fire chief of Atlanta, Georgia. Didn't have anything to do with his ability to fight fires or to inspire his fellow firefighters to run into burning buildings and save people. He was fired because he stood up and spoke out. You all know the story of the cake baker in Colorado, the florist in Washington State, the wedding planners, the singers, people who just wanted to do their jobs, fulfill their vocations, follow their callings, but wanted to do it in a way consistent with their beliefs as Christians or observant Jews or Muslims, or just as people who believe in marriage and sexual integrity. In some of those cases, these are not even people who spoke out or made a big deal about it. They weren't big mouths like me necessarily. They just said, no, I can't do that, when asked to participate in something that they believed to be immoral, in an activity that their conscience could not uphold. And suddenly, their livelihoods are in jeopardy. Their careers are in jeopardy. Now, in many cases, those who persecute the Kelvin Cochrans of the world, and the Baronelle Stutzmans, she's the florist of the world, and the Jack Phillips, he's the baker in Colorado of the world, are doing it not primarily as a way of getting that particular person to provide a service against his or her conscience. They are doing it rather, in the words of the French revolutionaries, pour encourager les autres. And encourager here is used ironically. To encourage the others, what does that mean? To put fear in the hearts of you and you and you and me, so that by having made an example of Kelvin Cochran or Baronel Stutzman or Jack Phillips, we will be frightened into conformity or at least silence. But we mustn't do that. We mustn't do that. We mustn't yield to that bullying. We mustn't yield to that intimidation. We are all called to be witnesses to truth. I don't care what your tradition is, whether you're an evangelical Protestant, whether you are a Catholic, whether you are a Mormon, whether you are an Eastern Orthodox Christian, whether you are an observant Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist. In all of these traditions, in their highest and best manifestations, they recognize that we are all called to be witnesses to truth. Truth is central to all the great traditions of faith. There are different teachings about the content and nature of truth. Yes, that's true. But we are all called, certainly those of us who are Christians know that we are called to speak truth, including speaking truth to power. And people who are very much opposed to what the Love and Fidelity Network stands for are today very much in power. We're to speak truth in love, that's for sure. Never harshly, never unkindly. But we are to speak truth and speak it boldly. And it's there that the courage is needed. To speak the truth about marriage today. To speak the truth about sexual integrity today. To speak the truth about chastity, to speak it boldly, requires courage. And since it doesn't come naturally to any of us, we have to put it in to each other. So my job is not only to speak the truth to you and to anyone else who will listen. My job is to put courage in you. And your job is not simply to speak the truth boldly to anybody who will listen. Your job is to put courage in me and courage in all your friends and associates who know the truth and need the courage to speak it. If we have that courage, we will prevail. If we will all be like my friend Mary Eberstadt and speak the truth, no matter what, no matter the risks, no matter the dangers, no matter what people think of you, no matter what names they call you, we will prevail. And what's important is not that we prevail because we are us and we want to win. What's important is that marriage prevail and sexual integrity prevail and virtue prevail. Now, why do I say we will prevail? After all, it's a small minority today. Our view was once the common sense, the common wisdom across cultures and traditions and over time. But gee, we're just the ragtag renegades. We're today just the small dissenting faction. Why do I think we'll win? We're going to win because truth has power. Truth has luminosity. The late Pope, John Paul II, talked about the splendor of truth. And he was on to something big there. Truth has a certain splendor, a luminosity, a power, but only when it's spoken. And it's up to us to speak it. Truth doesn't speak itself. If someone's going to speak truth and unleash the power of truth, somebody's going to have the courage to speak it. We're going to have to put the courage in each other to speak it. But when we do that, we will prevail. And we'll prevail because we deserve to prevail. And we'll prevail not because we want victory for victory's sake, but we want victory for the sake of the precious human beings who can only flourish, and that's all human beings in all communities, who can only truly flourish where culture supports marriage and sexual integrity and chastity and the virtues. Why do we try our best, even in the face of this hostility, to speak up for these virtues? Why are we here? Why does the Love and Fidelity Network exist? Is it because we're a bunch of Puritans who are shuddering at the thought that somebody somewhere is having fun? No. That's not us. That's not why we're going to take these risks, form these organizations, speak out boldly, put courage in each other. It's because we know what the world looks like where the culture of marriage flourishes and what the world looks like when the culture of marriage is degraded and lost. We know what the world looks like when culture encourages chastity, sexual integrity, and what the world looks like when it doesn't. What the world looks like when the culture is a culture of promiscuity and pornography and self-indulgence and licentiousness. That world, a world of promiscuity and pornography and licentiousness and self-indulgence, is not a world safe for children. It's not a world conducive to the flourishing of human beings. By contrast, a world which upholds marriage, in which marriage is upheld, which sexual integrity and chastity are honored, is a world where we human beings can flourish, where men and women can enter into healthy and mutually supportive and uplifting and ennobling relationships, when a world in which the children with whom those parents are blessed can grow up with dignity and protected in a way that they simply cannot be in a so-called sex-positive culture. We're sex-positive, okay? Nobody believes in sex more than we do. But we know what sex is for and why it's good. And we know what it can do to harm precious human beings, beginning with children and women and families, when it is simply regarded as recreation. All this predation people are talking about today, the Me Too stuff, that's for real. I've seen enough, even in our own disciplinary system here at Princeton, to know how for real sexual harassment, sexual coercion is. But that itself, in part, it's not the whole story, but in part, reflects an attitude in which sex is considered a kind of gratification, rather than the way a man and a woman unite to form the conjugal bond of marriage, where in that bond their sexual partnership, a partnership made possible by their sexual reproductive complementarity, becomes the foundation and matrix for a comprehensive sharing of life, what Ryan Anderson and Sharif Girgis and I call the conjugal view of marriage, in which the biological foundation of marriage serves as the foundation for a sharing at the emotional, the rational, the volitional, the dispositional, and the spiritual level. One in which men and women understand themselves as equal and equally deserving respect. An understanding in which, once you've got it, the idea of treating another person, of a man treating a woman as a sex object, is just hateful. The very idea would fly in the face of conscience. Now, how do we get from here to there? How do we get from our current situation, as deeply problematical as it is, to a situation in which sex in our culture once again has dignity and beauty? One in which men and women do understand themselves as equal in fundamental worth and dignity, where the idea of predation is hateful to anyone, so hateful that one would resist any impulse to do it. How do we get there? Well, I don't have the 5-year plan or the 10-year plan or even 50-year plan. Sorry about that. But I do know how it begins. It begins by speaking out, speaking up, speaking truth in love to cultural power. And to do that, we need courage. My final point now. How do we get that courage? Where are the resources in us for the courage that we need ourselves and that we need as part of our jobs to put into each other, that encouragement? I submit to you that the courage we need, we will have if we cultivate 3 other virtues, and they are very familiar to all of you. They are the great theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And by faith, I don't merely mean religious faith, although that's very powerful and important and helpful. But I mean the faith that enables us to stand fast to the truth even when we're being gaslighted all over the place. When there are active efforts to persuade us that we must be crazy for believing what we believe. It takes faith to affirm what reason tells you is true when everyone around you is telling you you're crazy. Hope. By hope, let me tell you, young men and women, I do not mean optimism. Never, ever confuse optimism with truth, or with hope. Don't confuse it with truth either, but certainly don't confuse it with hope. And that's confusion we see all over the place. Optimism is about optics. If you ask me whether I'm optimistic, I don't know. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, in my own lifetime, I've seen things happen that I never dreamed would even be conceivable, much less possible. So I don't know. Are we going to win? I don't know. But I am hopeful. Hope is a virtue. It involves volition. It involves will. And I have that hope because I know the luminosity and the splendor and the power of truth. So I know that if we muster the courage to speak it boldly out loud in love to power, we will prevail. And finally, the courage we need depends on the virtue of love. Why do we do this? Why do we take these risks? Why do we put ourselves on the line? Why should we even attempt to muster the courage to fly in the face of cultural power? It's because of our love for our fellow human beings. It's because we do not want children growing up in the kinds of circumstances in which far too many children grow up in today. We know the consequences of fatherlessness. We know the consequences of fatherlessness in particular for the poorest and most vulnerable sectors of our society. We know the consequences of the hookup culture. We know the consequences of a culture of promiscuity. We know the consequences for precious human beings whom it is our duty to love of the collapse of sexual integrity and of the loss of even a basic understanding of what marriage is as a conjugal partnership. We know the consequences of the collapse of the idea of marriage into mere sexual romantic companionship or domestic partnership, which we can enter into, exit at will with no-fault divorce, enter into or exit depending on, whether the mood favors it or mood favors it, as in cohabitation or get married. Oh, I don't know. We could stay in a cohabiting relationship or we could get married. Doesn't make much difference. Even to children. We know what the consequences of that bad thinking are. And those consequences are consequences for flesh and blood human beings. So sometimes my more skeptical colleagues who are skeptical about me, will say, okay, look, even if you think for the sake of argument, even if we grant for the sake of argument that you're right about marriage, that marriage is what you and Ryan Anderson and Sharif Girgis say it is, and it's not what's being promoted today. Marriage is the idea of sexual romantic companionship and domestic partnership. Even if you're right about that, why do you put so much emphasis on it? Why do you prioritize it in that way? I mean, you could be spending your time fighting poverty, fighting violence, fighting gangs. Why do you do this controversial stuff about marriage? We all agree fighting poverty is good, fighting gangs is good, fighting violence is good. And I say to them, my friends, you just don't get why I'm so interested in marriage, why I do prioritize that. Because marriage is the greatest anti-poverty program that was ever created. Why do young men, and I've done some work, joined with my beloved friend, Pastor Eugene Rivers, Church of God in Christ in Boston. Why do people join gangs? Why do young men in particular join gangs? You know what they're looking for? Families. Families. If you don't have a family, if you don't have a dad, the temptation is to go to look for one. And gangs provide what families are supposed to provide. Of course, gangs don't really provide it. Gangs provide something much worse. But if you want to fight poverty, if you want to fight gangs, if you want to fight violence, the best thing we could do is fight for the institution of marriage. And you'll only have a healthy, flourishing marriage culture where it's supported by a culture of sexual integrity. So it's out of love that we fight. And for the sake of love, for the sake of the precious people we love, we do have to muster the courage to fight. And for that reason, I salute you for your work. I salute you for being here. I know it takes courage to belong to an LFN affiliate on many campuses, perhaps on most campuses. But I really praise you and thank you for exemplifying that courage. So let's encourage each other. Thanks.